On the 30th of January 1946, 14 German soldiers were brought to the gallows inside of Minsk, and over 100,000 civilians had come to watch the executions of those who had all been condemned to death. All of these men were accused of being members of the Wehrmacht, SS and other officials who committed horrific crimes in Belarus during the German occupation and during Operation Barbarossa. The Germans committed scores of atrocities and crimes in the Soviet Union and in different countries as they rampaged east. During the occupation of Belarus, the Germans would slaughter over 2 million people. They would also deport hundreds of thousands of people to concentration camps, and many were executed outside settlements and villages where they lived. Join us today as we look at the executions of the German soldiers at Minsk, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The Germans launched Operation Barbarossa on the 22nd of June 1941, and it was the largest land offensive in history, and over 10 million soldiers would take part in it. The Germans wanted to rampage to the east, and they would want to claim lands for German settlers to live in, and to begin with, the invasion surprised Stalin. The Germans and Soviets had signed a non-aggression pact years before, and because of this it took the Red Army by surprise. Hitler had been planning this for some time, and over 3.8 million soldiers of the Axis powers would invade the Soviet Union along an almost 3,000-kilometre front. They were supported by 600,000 vehicles and over 600,000 horses, and it was a huge operation. The invasion would open up the Eastern Front with the Germans fighting on two fronts, and on the Eastern Front there were some of the most brutal and bloody battles fought in history. Battles such as Stalingrad and Kursk saw thousands killed, and the Germans deliberately starved 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, and millions of civilians died as part of the hunger plan. There were many mass shootings and gassings, carried out by the Nazis, who would use the SS death squads, the Einsatzgruppen. These would follow the German army, and they would round up civilians and often force them to dig their own graves, and in these pits, the civilians would be led into them, before executioners on the edge of the pits stood and shot them. The German soldiers rampaged throughout lands, and many towns, villages and settlements were burned to the ground. Belarus would be fully occupied by the German military, and it had been ruled for 20 months before by the Soviets, and the Germans invaded, and the country would then suffer heavily. There were bloody battles in which cities were encircled and civilians suffered, and during the early days of the occupation, a Soviet partisan movement came around. Partisans would hide around in the woods and swamps, and they inflicted a lot of damage to German supply lines, and they would blow up railway tracks, bridges and other infrastructure used by the Axis soldiers. They also ambushed German soldiers, and during one attack, 4 German trains carrying Tiger tanks were destroyed, and the Germans had to also fight partisan activities, as well as the Soviets. But there were a huge amount of war crimes carried out by the German army, and there were 380,000 people deported for slave labour from Belarus, and hundreds of thousands were executed. The Germans wanted to exterminate the complete Slavic population, and over 9,000 settlements were burned and destroyed in Belarus. Ghettos were then set up, and one was established inside of Minsk. The ghetto here housed 100,000 Jews, and inside of here the conditions were terrible, and the Germans would slaughter and execute at different times. A second ghetto would be created, and here every night around 70 people were executed when they got there from other countries and lands. Jews were forced to work in factories or other German-run industry, and in March 1942 the Nazis liquidated a nursery and orphanage. It was said of this horrific event in Minsk that, at that moment, several SS officers, among them Wilhelm Körber, arrived, whereupon Körber, immaculate in his uniform, threw handfuls of sweets to the shrieking children. All the children then perished in the sand. There were pits where thousands of Jews were executed and killed, and the ghetto was liquidated on the 21st of October 1943, with most of the inhabitants then being sent to the Sobibor extermination camp. But at the end of the Second World War, a series of war crimes trials were held in the city and in various cities around the Soviet Union and in different lands to punish Nazi war criminals. The Minsk trials took place in 1946 in the capital of Soviet Belarus, and those brought to trial were members of the German military and SS officials who had caused chaos inside of the country. 18 men were placed on trial and were accused of crimes committed during the occupation of Belarus, and this included 11 members of the Wehrmacht, including 2 Wehrmacht generals, 4 members of the Nazi police, a police general, and 3 members of the Waffen-SS and SD. Johann Georg Rickert, was a German general who commanded the 286th Security Division and also the 35th Infantry Division. His soldiers conducted operations against partisans, and Rickert ordered that all of his own soldiers who were in hospital without injury or diagnosed illness were to be executed, and he was a brute who threatened other commanding officers. He would force around 40,000 civilians into a death camp, and the establishment of this camp was said to have been one of the worst crimes the Wehrmacht ever committed against civilians. He was one of those brought to trial, alongside Gottfried von Erdmannsdorf, another general who commanded the Ordnungspolizei in the Minsk region. General Erdmannsdorf established Fortress Mogilev and held this position, but he was accused of the deportations of 10,000 people, destructions of villages, schools and churches. He was also linked to the shootings of disabled people during the constructions of fortifications and the use of people as human shields. He was also accused of the establishment of camps where people were sent to. Eberhard Herf was the commander of the Police Regiment North and Order Police units in Minsk. He would encourage and order the mass murder in the Army Group North area, and then became the commander of the Order Police in Minsk, where he was in control of the mass murder of Jews in the ghetto there. He became a general in the Order Police, and it was said he eventually wanted to get out of the East as he had had enough. But he was responsible for the executions of thousands. Also brought to the Minsk trial were George Robert Weissling, commander of the 26th SS Police Regiment, Ernst August Falk, battalion commander in the 26th SS Police Regiment, Reinhard George Moll, the local commander of the Babrusk, Karl Lentz, the commander of a POW camp, Hans Hermann Koch, chief of the SIPO, and an Einsatzgruppe officer, Rolf Bouchard, special commander in Babrusk, August Bittner, Sonderführer, and chief of the farm slave labourers, Bruno Goetzer, commander, Paul Eick, a deputy commander, Bruno Mittmann, a soldier in Minsk, Franz Hess, a Sonderkommando member, Heinz Fischer, an SS cavalry corporal, Hans Höchel, a Wehrmacht private, along with Alois Hetterich and Albert Rodenbusch, two other Wehrmacht privates. Inside of the courtroom, all of the men were accused of crimes against humanity. They were all convicted of the horrors carried out in Belarus. But 14 of those were sentenced to death, and their executions would be carried out inside of a horse racing venue in Minsk. The 3 generals were all condemned, and to the people of Minsk who had suffered greatly under German occupation, these men were evil. They had seen their friends and family members slaughtered and executed, with many being sent to concentration camps. And these trials in Minsk were considered like the Nuremberg trials. But on the 30th of January 1946, those men who had been condemned to death in the Minsk trials were brought out to their executions. A huge gallows site had been created in the horse racing venue in Minsk, which was known as the Hippodrome. 100,000 civilians had gathered to see the executions of those men who had been sentenced to death. They were brought out one by one to the gallows. On the gallows a number of nooses had been placed, and then the men were placed on a vehicle, and the noose was then tied around their necks before the vehicle was then pulled off, and each of the men were left there dangling and hanging. 14 of them were hanging from the gallows at the same time, and to the people of Minsk who had suffered greatly, these executions of these men were completely justified. The German soldiers in Minsk were all condemned for the mass slaughter they had participated in across Belarus and the Soviet Union. They had been involved in the executions of civilians and the deportations of thousands to concentration and extermination campsites, where they were then killed when they arrived. The country suffered heavily under German occupation, and the Nazis caused chaos there. But some of those executed were military generals, and these were high-ranking members of the military that rubbed shoulders with Hitler. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.